Hello, everyone. I almost said good evening because it's evening where I am right now. I am in Bristol in the UK. It is absolutely my pleasure to talk to you today about pay equity and gender equality. As Elena said, I'm the founder and CEO of Gapsquare. I founded Gapsquare about 7 years ago when the World Economic Forum was saying that it will be 217 years to close the gender gap. At the same time, the World Economic Forum was saying that by 2030, a lot of us will be in self-driving cars. We're getting reports from NASA that are saying that by 2030, we'll be waving off the first people going onto Mars. And yet somehow, when we're there in 2030 in our self-driving cars, waving people off to Mars, we're still 200 years away from achieving gender equality. So I started thinking, is there any way in which we can leverage technology to look into how we can address the gender gap and the gender pay gap in particular? I've worked a little bit in the space of women's rights before then, and one of the key things that continuously stood out to me is women's access to economic rights and how at that point, not a lot was being done about them. And the gender pay gap was a very good starting point for this. So what I started to do is looking at how we can use that technology and that innovation that looks at self-driving cars, that takes people off to Mars, and how can we utilize that innovation and how can we utilize that technology and use of data in order to address the pay gap. And initially my thinking was, surely there's a way in which we can utilize AI, plug in some data from HR and payroll, crunch some numbers, show companies what their pay gaps are, why the pay gaps are there, and then inevitably they're going to close them. We're going to close the pay gap by 2030. Job done. Except, of course, everything turned out to be a bit more complex than that. And utilizing data to look at pay equity and pay equality turned into a bigger job where we can actually utilize data to look at policies, to look at how jobs are constructed, how we value certain occupations. And the pandemic has played an imperative role in that. We look at the economy and we have absolutely seen the jobs that we have relied on in the past few years, like jobs in care, jobs in the nurses in hospitals, the doctors, jobs in delivery drivers who were delivering the food around supermarkets. And yet a lot of these jobs in our current economies are valued very little. So all of these issues have kind of started being unpacked through our use of data. And I hope I can take you today through a journey at looking how we can utilize tech as an opportunity to address these issues in a changing world of work. You would no doubt be familiar with words like the Great Resignation, like how the world of work is changing. So inevitably, this is a good space to look into how do we utilize that tech, how we utilize tech to look at jobs, to look at pay equity, to look at gender, race, and ethnicity and other employee characteristics so that we can provide for a more holistic approach to address pay inequity once for all and actually look at how we can create a more fair, more inclusive future of work. But before we move on, I thought it would be a good idea to kind of have so we're all on the same page in terms of what are we talking about? What is pay equity? What is equal pay? What is the gender pay gap? Because I'm sure a lot of you are already familiar with this, equal pay is kind of looking at equal pay for equal value, pay for like work. And legislation around this has been in place for nearly 50 years. I know in the UK, I think we celebrated 51st year last year of equal pay legislation, and yet still we have a lot of cases in employment tribunal that demonstrate that we still don't have equal pay. The women who were going to work 50 years ago, celebrating the Equal Pay Act in the UK, still see their daughters go to work and still be unequally paid. So equal pay is about equal pay for equal work, for like work and equivalent work. And interestingly enough, technology and the new world of work is unraveling new meanings around that too. So we recently had a case in the UK where the large supermarkets like Asda, like Sainsbury's, took employees from these large supermarkets, took their employers to employment tribunal because people at the checkouts were being paid differently than people in the warehouses. And in terms of occupational segregation, people at the checkouts were primarily women and people in the warehouses were primarily men. And at the end of the day, the Employment Tribunal concluded that both roles were actually bringing equal value to the business, and therefore they deserve equivalent pay for equivalent work. The gender pay gap looks at percentage difference in hourly pay between men and women, and anyone who knows the legislation in the UK around the gender pay gap will be familiar with the fact that that's what a lot of corporations here understand as the gender pay gap. They see it as the comparison of averages. So it's looking at the overall average of a man compared to the overall average of a woman, and understanding the difference between them. And usually sometimes it does have something to do with the equal pay for equal work, but primarily it is more to do with occupational segregation, more women clustered in roles that pay less, more men clustered in roles that pay more. It has to do with not enough women progressing in their careers into leadership roles, industries that historically attract more men or more women. So all of these issues cluster together into the gender pay gap and form the gender pay gap of an organization. So these are kind of two different ways in which we can look at pay equality. It's the equal pay and the comparison of equivalent work, and it's the more overall comparison of averages by organization, by industry, and by wider indicators. And what usually happens with these indicators is sometimes we don't know about them, but sometimes we know about them. And this is just a list, a small indicative list of countries in the world that have some kind of pay equity transparency legislation. So you will see that in most of them, organizations have an obligation to report their numbers. There's, with many of them, public registers where they log in their results and their pay gaps. There's third-party reviews even in some countries where the numbers have to be validated. And of course, there's even financial sanctions for non-compliance. The UK inevitably has equal pay legislation, so also came into effect about 50 years ago, same time as in the US. So the US has equal pay legislation, same time as in the UK. It's illegal in the US for employers to pay women lower wages. And there's actually a lot of new legislation that is being moved and being pushed across by more progressive politicians. We have major legislative proposals to address the wage gap in the proposed Paycheck Fairness Act. We have legislation that has come in California. Colorado has wage disclosure legislation, and actually employers need to disclose pay for jobs when they advertise them. There's a very interesting startup based in California called, I think they're called Buffer. And when you go on their website, they disclose everyone's pay. So you have a list of all of the employees from CEO all the way down, and all of their wages are disclosed, location, different kind of pay characteristics in there. So everything is very much transparent. In New York, there's salary bracket requirements in terms of job advertisement, and also New York has been very active in terms of promoting legislation that prohibits employers from asking people about their previous salary history. And Illinois is bringing forward some pay data reporting in 2023. More widely around the world, there's Netherlands that is introducing new legislation with a bill that requires companies with more than 250 employees to get a certificate that every 3 years will prove that women and men are equally remunerated within organizations. The French legislation is very interesting. It's part of the French professional future law, and it requires companies with at least 50 employees to calculate the gender equality index. And then if you get 75 points or more, you're considered compliant. And if not, you are non-compliant, and companies who don't comply then have 3 years to remedify their numbers, or they get a penalty. And I think so far, just 4% of companies have been deemed non-compliant. And the indicator looks at different factors. It looks at women's career progression. It looks at percentage of women benefiting from salary increases, number of employees in underrepresented roles, where roles that are more male dominated. pay gaps, and different other indicators. So I've included here a link to a list of resources where you can find more about these countries and about the kind of legislative compliance and transparency in the space of pay equality, equal pay, gender pay. Now, the reason I've mentioned this transparency is because the World Economic Forum has released the Gender Gap Index 2021. So it was released for International Women's Day in 2021. And the top 10 countries you can see in the list have pay transparency legislation. They actually have very advanced pay transparency legislation that requires companies to look at their numbers more in depth, report on them, and talk about their numbers with their employees, and be more transparent around pay equity. So as we would assume that kind of being at the forefront of pushing through more transparency leads to better ranking on this index, because the numbers look better for these countries. So this is kind of one of the big part of this is there's legislative and there's transparency kind of push factors into the market that get more and more companies and more organizations to look at their gaps, report their gaps, understand what they are, talk to their employees about the gaps. But there's also the wider factors of the economy. And I'd like to talk about them too, because they're important in the context of looking at wage equality and looking at the future of work and understanding what the gender pay gap will look like in the next 5 years. So in 2020, the World Economic Forum released a report on the future of jobs 2025. And it analyzed and looked at what does the future of work look like, what are we automating? What impact does this have on jobs? How many of the jobs are going to be driven out because of artificial intelligence? How the work is shifting? How tasks within a job are changing? And as a result of that report, they have produced 20 jobs with increased demand in the economy in the next 5 years, and 20 jobs with decreased demand in the next 5 years. So, in terms of the top 20 jobs with increasing demand, it will be as no surprise to any of us that a lot of them are tech related. They're tech related jobs, and we already know that tech is kind of becoming a big part of our economies, and digital economies are increasingly large in the Western world. And amongst these jobs, there are jobs on the increase include data analyst, data scientist, AI and machine learning specialists, big data specialists, software and application specialist, Internet of Things, project managers, all of these very much male-dominated roles. And on average, they pay £45,500 a year. And they're very much male-dominated. If you look at on this side, where it's roles like the jobs on the increasing demand, the jobs in blue are the male-dominated ones. If you look at the female-dominated ones, the jobs like business development professional, business services, and admin manager, and there's one more that I can see, organizational development specialist, they are all significantly lower paid than the male-dominated roles. They are kind of between 26,000 and 29,000 a year, almost twice less than the male-dominated jobs on the increase over the next 5 years. If we look on the right, then there's what we see is the top 20 jobs with decreasing demand. And we see automatically by the color, because we've color coded them, is that a lot of the jobs with decreasing demand are female dominated. We have data entry clerks, admin and executive secretaries, accounting and bookkeeping, accountants and auditors, business services and admin managers, financial analysts, very much female dominated roles that are on the decrease. And if you compare what they earn on average, most of them are £26,000 a year. So twice less than the jobs on the increase. And it's probably not a surprise to any of us that we're looking at automating the lower paid jobs, because as a society, we're evolving and we're automating the lower paid jobs, but there's currently very little thinking and very little consideration on the extent to which this actually impacts the occupations and how more women are more clustered in this kind of roles. So looking at this kind of data allows us to build some context on the transparency. piece that I spoke about before, on the fact that we're kind of looking at legislations around the world, pushing for more transparency, pushing for us to be more open about pay in the context of an economy that is fastly developing into a digital economy that is very much male dominated, where a future of work is a future where more men are employed in the economy and men earn significantly more than women. If we look at averages and compare averages by 2025 of these jobs that are on the increase with some of the jobs on the decrease, we get to a gender pay gap of about 60%, which is significantly more than the current gender pay gap. And if we leave things the way they are, we are not moving away from the 217 years it will take to close the gap. We're actually moving further and further away from that number. So this is the kind of the more broader economical push and pull factors around it. We've spoken about the kind of the transparency piece, more governments around the world introducing legislation around this, and putting the two together, data about jobs and changing legislation and transparency requirements helps us understand things even more. And in the UK, we've been lucky because we've had access to transparency legislation around the gender pay gap for about 4 years. Regulations in the UK make it mandatory for companies with 250 people or more to look at their gender pay gaps and report on their pay gaps on an annual basis. So they look on the numbers and they have to report the mean, they have to report the median pay by company. So they look at comparing averages specifically, not equal pay of equal value. And then they report on the quartiles. So the quartiles are a distribution of the workforce from the lowest paid to the highest paid. You split them in 4 categories. And these are the kind of the quartiles: the lowest paid quartile, middle, lowest, upper, higher, and highest pay quartile. And we've looked at some data in the UK to try and understand the upper quartiles. What does women in top 25 percentile of highest paid jobs across different industries look like? So we've looked at a few industries, and on this graph on the right, where you can see total gender split by industry in the UK, you can see the female and male representation across industries. So manufacturing, for instance, is largely male dominated, 75% male dominated. Other services, activities, and services in general are more female dominated at about 60%, I would say. Then you have financial and insurance, you have professional scientific, it kind of still slightly more male dominated, but coming towards being a 50-50, including the wholesale and retail trade, where actually you could see a lot, when we go to the shops, we go to the malls, we go to the supermarkets, a lot of this front-facing staff is women. But when you look at the little circles on next to this graph by industry, it shows you what the percentage is of women in the top quartile. So what does the percentage women in top quartile look like for different industries? In manufacturing, we've seen that women make up only 25%. And overall in the industry, and we see that in the top quartile, they make up 20%, fair enough. It's getting to a close representation across the entire industry. If we look at where was the other services activities, is very much a female dominated activity at about 60%, but at the same time, when it gets to the top quartile, only 44% are women. Wholesale and retail trade, which looks like a 50-50, only 33% women at the top are, only 33% at the top are women. Administrative and support roles, again, occupational segregation and kind of our stereotypes about what roles are occupied by men and what roles are occupied by women, only 37% of the roles at the top in that industry are occupied by women. So having access to data in a world of transparency allows us to understand and unpick what is actually happening when you get into the detail. Yes, the pay gaps are 80%, but what does it, 20%, but what does it mean? Are they driven by occupational segregation because there are more men in a sector and more women in another sector? Are they driven by things like lack of women in leadership roles? Are they driven by something that is known as the motherhood penalty? Sometimes when you look at pay gaps, You see age 30 being an indicator of when pay gaps start increasing in comparison between men and women, largely due to the fact that women take on caring responsibilities. So looking at this data holistically has given us a better understanding. In this context, it's helped us understand that there's a significant issue when it comes to women at the top. And looking at data that is looking at us in the face, because 10,000 companies in the UK have reported these numbers, allows us to move away from that discourse that this is a political issue or this is an emotional issue. Actually, it becomes also a data issue. It's a data issue that you can look in the face and say, in administrative and support, there's only 37% women in the UK in the entire industry. Why is that? We can unpick it and start looking at it. This is where we get, unpicking it is where we get to the interesting part of it. And when I was talking to Iris the other week about how we look and understand the kind of the data bias and who looks at the data and what it means to the people who look at the data, it reminded us of the work that we do at Gapsquare with personas and how we kind of understand or try to understand the people who use our software and what kind of interests do they have when they look at the data? What kind of perspectives do they have when they look at the data? What are they most likely to unpick when they look at that data? So we have kind of different type of personas. One of the personas is the leadership person. The leadership person, the CEO, the person in charge, usually interested in company sustainability, profit, and reputation. Significantly, when it comes to progressive corporates and growth ventures, more and more of these organizations are starting to looking at ESGs. Some of that is still the kind of the historical ticker box ESG reports, but a lot of companies are starting to move towards more kind of meaningful and intentional understanding of their impact on sustainability, their impact on social justice, their impact on people, on planet. And we see some of those in like companies such as, for instance, Unilever, which more recently in their reports, in their annual reports, in addition to their performance indicators being the financial indicators, started looking very much at fairness indicators. So what does the gender pay gap look like across the company? What does the gender pay gap look like in the supply chain? What does the gender pay gap looks like in different other parts of the organization and subcontractors? How fairly do the subcontractors pay the employees? So the kind of that leadership role is very significant because it sets the tone and sets the drive for the agenda. And it's really it's an interesting role, not least because it also brings the agenda of diversity and inclusion and pay equity into the business. Because what we have had for very many years is the pay equity agenda, the fairness agenda, the diversity and inclusion agenda run in parallel to the business. So the business is here, this is the business plan, this is the targets of what we want to try to achieve. This is when we want to IPO, this is when we want to become a unicorn. And then somewhere on the side, there's this small group that is tasked with diversity and inclusion, and they have a $10,000 a year budget, and they need to make things happen in the diversity and inclusion space. But that's not how things happen, and that's not how we're going to make significant change. And more people in leadership roles are starting to understand that these agendas, the two agendas about business indicators and diversity and inclusion and pay equity, need to become one agenda in order for organizations and companies to be successful. And as I've mentioned before, the changing future of work, the changing dynamics of jobs, coupled with the big resignations, is really forcing leadership at these large organizations to start thinking about what meaningful progress and change they can make in this space. In addition to the leadership person, we actually in Gapsquare, all of these people have names, but I didn't bring their names in here. But we also have the rewards team. The rewards team is usually tasked with utilizing data to build a salary structure, to understand what kind of pay and remuneration components they can pay to different people, different groups, how they can link pay to performance, how they can look at budgets to understand what more or what less rewards they can offer to their workforce. This is usually a financial role. And as a financial role, the first and foremost kind of driver for people in rewards is to save money. So it's sometimes counterintuitive to the role of actually understanding where the gaps are and solving the gaps by adding more money into the budget. So it's kind of on its own, this role will very rarely address pay equality in a meaningful, sustainable way. It's also a very interesting role in the age of the so many times mentioned Great Resignation, because if you look at the multiple reports and the multiple documentaries and the multiple interviews, people are leaving jobs even when rewards are going up, and actually rewards and compensation in the sense of pay and bonuses and other components aren't holding people down. Flexible work is, access to more inclusive policies, access to a work-life balance are overtaking over those kind of rewards. So this agenda in that sense, on its own, I'm not saying it's meaningless. Rewards and the head of rewards and the reward and compensation team have a huge role to play in pay equity, but on their own, this is only a very little piece of the puzzle. Then we also have the HR. The HR is the part of the organization that manages workforce, ensures compliance, is there to minimize attrition, to make sure that people stay, people grow, people learn and progress in their careers, and make sure that organization has access to talent. This is where talent acquisition sits. This is where learning and development sits. And in a broader sense, this is where the organization is managing its workforce through this department. And again, to some extent, on its own, somewhat limited, and also has been on a trajectory of learning itself. So initially, the HR as a function appeared to protect the employee, to make sure that the employee has access to resources, has access to the tools it needs to grow. And in time, as we have progressed over the past 10, 20 years, the HR department has become more of a function that protects the employer from the employees. So there's a lot of dichotomies in that role. There's a lot of kind of, in terms of strategic direction, what that role is trying to achieve versus what that role is actually required to achieve. And on its own, in terms of addressing pay equity, not necessarily, I think, able to create a lot of change. And then there's a role, the much discussed role of someone who's actually tasked with diversity and inclusion. And with best intent in the world, this kind of role has appeared a few years ago with the view of setting up organizations for success when it comes to diversity and inclusion. Now, the specific limitations of this person, and we've discovered that in recent years, is limited access to budget in terms of what this person could do. The person tasked with diversity and inclusion doesn't always sit within a department that has access to pay equity data. So they can't always align what their plans of actions are around diversity and inclusion with where the gaps are actually coming from when it comes to pay equity within the organization. So you can have the fact that in the marketing departments, the team has only been recruiting a certain type of employee, like a male 30-year-old person in there for years, but because that analytics and that data isn't available usually to the diversity and inclusion lead, that means that they can't align their activities, their plans, and their targets to that specific gap. So there's misalignment. So these are the kind of the four key drivers or key decision makers who have some effect on pay equity. They have some effect on creating more inclusive, more diverse organizations. The key challenge being that on their own, their roles are rather limited, and only when they work collaboratively and together and have access to data and information about pay gaps, they can take more data-driven decisions. And I know I've been talking a lot about the gender pay gap because that's how I've kind of titled the title of my talk from the very early days. But we also look at intersectionality, and we've been increasingly doing so in the past year and a half, since the murder of George Floyd has raised this issue more significantly within the organizations, and a lot more organizations are interested in understanding pay disparities for people of color. And when you start looking at that and unpicking that, it really is eye-opening in terms of how many structural inequalities exist within jobs and how many systems in place actually prevent people of color or women from achieving top leadership roles or from progressing in their careers or looking outside specific occupations where they are currently segregated. So maybe everything I've been saying so far has sounded like a lot of doom and gloom. Like, what are we gonna do? Everything is bad, but there's things that actually we can do. And I was gonna say we can do it all through data, and I would have told you so a few years ago. I would have said data can help us solve everything, but what I can tell you now is that data can help understand all of the symptoms that we have within organizations or within societies around pay equality. It can help us pinpoint to where the bad areas are, but that actually unpicks a lot of other things around policy, around legal, around bias, around transparency, and even more around data and what kind of data we look at. So I'm going to spend the next kind of 10 minutes going over these. I'm going to try and not bore you too much with my own voice, and then we can maybe engage in a conversation around this, because I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts. But we'll start with policy. As we've seen at the kind of the beginning of the presentation, policy around transparency is leading more and more countries around the world to require organizations to look at their gaps, understand what their gaps are, share that with their employees, and creating national policy that facilitates that kind of transparency, but also national policy that then also looks at why those gaps are there. So for instance, one of the key gaps that we've seen in the tech sector, because that's one of the biggest growing sector, is that there are not a lot of women that are entering the sector, and therefore not a lot, even less women making it through the pipeline and progressing in their careers. And it all comes back to the fact that there's not enough women studying science, technology, engineering, and maths, and also not enough of us thinking about jobs in STEM as being more diverse than we currently see them. We currently see jobs in STEM as very kind of specific, and they could be broader than that. And that's when national policy could come in terms of addressing that through educational policy, addressing that through policies that facilitate kind of and encourage more young women to look at STEM and create a kind of a more level playing field in that space. And there's also policies that, if we move outside occupational segregation, I'd see policies around care that facilitate for more men and women to be able to enter the workforce and go back into the economy because they have childcare taken care of. We did some research at the beginning of the pandemic about what kind of impact would national policy around care have on a country's GDP and on a country's happiness levels. And as you would expect, indicators are quite high in terms of the impact on GDP. So if there were policies that were creating spaces and places for women to have access to care, women and men to have access to care where they can have their children taken care of, they would go to the economy, back into the economy 100%. They could increase productivity, they could benefit from being engaged in work. And company policy is the same. We looked at what the cost would be for a company to introduce free access to childcare for all of their employees. What would the impact on GDP be, taking into account their productivity would go up? And what would the impact on EBIT would be, taking into account that have more people working in the organization, and both would significantly go up. So there are different ways in which policies can affect and impact pay equity and pay equality. From a legal point of view, there's also equal pay and overall pay regulations. So in the UK, in addition to the gender pay gap legislation that requires companies to be transparent about their pay gaps, there's also legislation that requires companies to report on the difference in pay between their chief executive and the average employee, and also the chief executive and the kind of the average pay in each quartile, so we can see by how many times that pay differs. So pay regulations make it more like bring the legal at the forefront of this. There's a kind of, it's a double-sided coin, this one, because what you also have sometimes is the legal profession kind of looking into how they can protect the employer and how they can look at ensuring that the employer is not doing anything that is an equal pay issue. So there's the legal side on it that kind of needs to align with the policy and implementation of the agenda. There's also biases. Inevitably, there are biases, and we are biased in when we take our decisions. You would have all probably heard the story of the surgeon, was the story of like there's a car accident and a dad and his boy get in the car accident, and the boy needs to be taken to hospital, and the surgeon comes in, looks at the boy and says, I can't operate on this boy, he is my child. And so who is the doctor is the big question, to which May, who's worked in the women's rights space for all my life, I still couldn't think that that could be his mom. That's not the first thought that came to my mind. Bias is a big part of who we are and how we take decisions. They're still a big part of, for instance, what toys people bring to my girls when it's their birthday parties. They're still a big part of how we think about who is suitable to be a leader in an organization. When we recruit someone, there's biases around thinking who would be more suitable for a support role and who would be more suitable for a project management role. So all of these biases need to be taken into account. And I know there's one exciting lecture coming up in the next few in the series that is led by Kate Glassberger, who has founded Be Applied around unbiased recruitment. I'm looking forward to that one. And so biases are inevitably a big part of this. And we see biases in numbers. Sometimes we look at the data for an organization and you can see how in senior roles, they have always recruited men and they have always recruited them from outside. So at no point did they think that maybe there's someone suitable within the organization who could take on those roles. It's like biases, small biases and big biases like this shape and create a lot of pay inequity. There's also the building block of transparency. And one of the key things is that transparency is driven by legislation. We've seen the top 10 performing countries when it comes to the gender gap index, but also platforms like Glassdoor and many other platforms that create the space for people to share how much they earn within specific roles in an organization is creating even more transparency. And this is why a lot of organizations should and are actually looking more actively into how they can ensure that they live up to that transparency. There are a lot of new platforms and systems, especially around Silicon Valley, where people talk about how much they get offered for different jobs at Google, at Twitter, at Facebook. And so they get to compare. You have people in similar roles talking about how they have negotiated their pay, being more transparent about how much they earn. So all of these platforms and all of this data is pushing and creating more opportunity for us to take pay equity more seriously. And then, of course, the big piece for me, data. Data about employees, data about pay determining characteristics like data about pay determining characteristics, data about the job details. Like if you look at pay determining characteristics like performance, like length of service, education, any kind of additional skills that the people bring into the role, and compare that with the job details. What are the tasks within the job? What does the job require? What does it entail? And how those two actually come together is a really important piece of the data puzzle. And data is one key thing to remember is data is biased. We all remember the Amazon case where the handful of data scientists in Edinburgh were required to develop some algorithms to help Amazon recruit top engineers around the world. And then those algorithms ended up recruiting more men than women and actually actively dismissing CVs that were coming from people who had the word woman in their CV. So data is a big part of understanding pay equity, but at the same time, we have to understand first and foremost, the data is biased. The data comes from a world where policy is flawed, where transparency hasn't always been a thing. So we need to review and relook at how we utilize data. And when I started Gapsquare, I was thinking, how difficult can this be? You look at pay data, you look at specific jobs, you understand pay per hour, you compare them, you get the outcome of the gaps. But actually, it's bigger than that. The data piece is bigger than that because we can't only look at pay. We always need to utilize data to look at the jobs. What are these jobs telling us? What are the tasks that make up a job? So if we start deconstructing those jobs, for instance, a project manager in finance will earn differently than a project manager in IT or a project manager in marketing. So in unpicking the tasks that make up each job, we can then look closer at examining how we can align and level up that pay between these different occupations. Also, there's a lot of kind of newer talk about looking at pay per skill and the skills that people bring into the organization, which is also interesting and moving away from the kind of the more old-fashioned value we've assigned to jobs. But any kind of conversation we have now about how we review jobs and how we review pay, and do we want to start paying by outputs, or do we want to start paying by tasks, or do we want to start paying by skills, is still a conversation for all of us to have. And I'm actually quite excited about this conversation. And I think more of us should be involved across policy, across legal, across kind of creating transparency and working with data to unpick all of these issues and look into how we can create a more fair system of pay and a world where pay is more fair and more inclusive for everyone within the organization.